Chapter 1 Armen, February 8th, 1925. Armen Ararat dreamed that he ran parallel to the train. Peering in, trying to keep up, he wondered where it was headed as it accelerated across the plateau. Straining with the last of his will to keep up, he looked into its compartment. He could hardly make out what was within. Just as it was about to surge down the tracks, he saw. He himself sat there, eating chocolate. On the seats all about him were the bodies of the dead. He sat up in bed. Someone was knocking at his door. "Armen, it's time to wake up," Mrs. Hagopian, the landlady, said outside. "I will get up, Madame Baroness," he said in formal Armenian. He knew he had dreamed and could remember only a feeling of breathless distress. He had lived with the sensation for a decade, since he was 14, when he saw and heard things about which he could not feel at peace. Armen unbent his sleepy limbs, rose and dressed. As he walked to the bathroom near his room, his small, attentive landlady disappeared down the stairs to the first floor. Then, in his room, he thought of his early morning appointments tutoring freshmen at the university. As usual, Madame Hagopian had kindly awakened him. She ran her boarding house in Berkeley with the genteel efficiency she had possessed a decade before while reigning over her haute bourgeois household in Constantinople. Armenians sometimes called her the Red Baroness, out of respect for the refinement of her upbringing and the passion of her leftist politics. Now, in America, Armen was drawn to her idealistic socialism, partly because he felt such an allegiance to the new socialist republic of Soviet Armenia, which was so vulnerable next to Turkey. And reading the New Masses and other left-wing papers, he found an indignation at injustice like the bitterness he poured into some of his poetry. This month he had written "In Exile I Cannot Forget," with its last lines: "Under the blinding sun, passing alien grain, I ride the hurtling train of my black fate. The other exiles and I weep in rage and pain, for with us sit the beloved bodies of the dead." Madame Hagopian was a short, thin-boned woman with delicate shoulders, and she always held herself with her back straight. Her thick brown hair was pulled carefully into a bun, prematurely peppered with gray, and her drawn face possessed an intensity that seemed a vestige of the pride and elegance of her years before 1915. After the death in that year of her husband, an esteemed lawyer for the Sultan, she had gathered all she could of the family's savings and fled with her children from their regal home, traveling across the globe to San Francisco. Now she owned this large Victorian house in Berkeley, renting out the second and third floor rooms and living on the first floor with her son and daughter. His landlady's spirit had been tempered into an unblinking graciousness in the decades since her husband had been arrested at midnight on April 24th, 1915. Later that morning, almost a decade ago, on April 24th, Armen had been taken by a teacher to Constantinople's Galata district to visit the great poet Varujan. When they arrived, there were rumors that something was happening across the Golden Horn in Beyazıt Square, the huge public space in the center of the city. "Go home," his teacher Oshigan had said. "Hurry." Yet he delayed, and alone he began to walk down Galata Hill through the crowded labyrinth of streets. Groups of Turkish Muslims milled about the dusty byways. Most of the Christian Armenians, Greeks, and Jews, who normally filled the quarter, had locked their shops and homes and were nowhere to be seen. He hurried south to Galata Bridge, where the passage became thick with people. His pace slowed, and he felt paralyzed in the hostile element, as the water of the Golden Horn sparkled below in the April sun. He burst out of the bottleneck on the bridge and sprinted down a wide palatial avenue to Bayezid Square. He must see what was happening, but the vast public space was packed with men. There was the smell of dust and sweat from the multitude, as well as an odd odor of metal, of damp rust. A loud hum rose, curses and catcalls, prayers and rants in choppy, surging waves of the city's languages. He slipped closer and closer, but always he saw before him a wall of backs which towered over him. Some were clothed in coarse cloth, and others in nicely cut European suits. Some heads wore fezzes or bowler hats, and others were bare. Some bald, and others with hair scruffy or carefully shaved at the neck. The sea of heads churned before him, the bobbing heads allowing him only brief glimpses. There seemed to be a gallows set up for a public execution in the center of the square, and then suddenly he saw the phalanx of gendarmes and soldiers standing at attention below a score of hanging men. A bloated ripeness had stiffened the bodies, and a crowd of flies hovered around the corpses. Some had been sliced, and the blood had set and darkened the clothing where the knives had slit. His eyes were raw and fixed in place. All the executed seemed to be Armenians, 20 men hanging before him. He saw one of his teachers suspended in the middle of one row of gallows. It was his history professor, mutilated and dead. And then he recognized the contorted face of Baron Hagopian. The lawyer's fine European suit had been slit in several places, and the blood had splotched and thickened. The wall of backs closed in on him. The milling crowd in this sweep of public space seethed with a peculiar lust. He had been reckless to come here, and stealthily now he dodged away from the crowd. He could hardly breathe, yet he ran and retraced his path back to the Galatá Bridge. He must report the horror he had seen to Oshagan, whose writing would tell a new generation of the catastrophe. He ran and ran, but made little progress as he crossed the bridge again and stared at the fetid water below. He ran through the maze of dusty streets and past the knots of Turks standing around as their children played in the guttered lanes. He gasped for each breath as he clambered up through the steep neighborhood and finally strode around the corner of Varujan's street. There he halted. A half-block away, at the poet's door, nearly a dozen gendarmes gathered. They surrounded Varujan, grasped him, and forced him to march down the boulevard to a waiting cart. 2 officers had followed, arms akimbo, chatting and smiling as if they were at a fair. Now he knew he was late. He took his notebook and a book in French from the desk and descended the rooming house stairs, 2 at a time. Passing the dining room, he glanced in. "You had no breakfast," Mrs. Hagopian called to him. He said he had no time. The big Victorian house was covered in dark-stained shingles and had a large turret, a curved bay window, and a wide porch. Armin bounded down its high steps into the February fog and ran to Telegraph Avenue. There he began walking past the small 1- and 2-story shops clustered in the blocks approaching Sather Gate, the entrance to the university. A pharmacy, tobacconists, cafes, and food stalls selling American food, and a scattering of bookstores. None of it was as impressive as the student district in Constantinople, but his sense of that city was ghostly now, and fleeting memories floated in and out of his awareness as Armin ran across the bridge at Sather Gate. The fog was slowly lifting, and he hummed a bittersweet folk song. Alakia sarn abelas. Clouds are shrouding the mountain. He took the steps up 2 at a time in front of Wheeler Hall, the new building for the humanities departments. Bonjour, he returned the greeting of the head of the French department as he passed her office on the second floor. The gray-headed woman had interviewed him last spring and arranged for him to work as a tutor to first-year students. He had been exempted from lower division courses and admitted to the upper division French major. In Constantinople, he had translated Verlaine and a novel by Anatole France into Armenian. Armin had hoped to go to Paris and attend the Sorbonne, and he had cousins in France. But when he was 19 and about to depart, his uncle Haig had written from Central California to summon him, come work with him there for a year on the farms near Fresno, and earn enough to bring his brother, his sister, and his mother, who was Uncle Haig's sister, out of the cauldron of Turkey and to the safety of America. So he, and then his family, had come and had worked themselves to the bone, picking grapes day in and day out under the burning sun, or packing apricots and peaches in the stifling sheds. He remembered driving with his uncle to pick up his family at the Fresno train station, and then on the way south to Delano, stopping in the town of Yetum near the Sierra foothills. The little Armenian church there was the oldest in the valley and was right next to the cow pasture. Incense came through the open doors and mixed with the farts of nearby cows. Mama began to cry. It reminded her so much of the village. And now, 5 years later, it was 1925, and here he was in Berkeley, a student and teaching assistant at the University of California. His old teacher Oshagan, in Beirut now, writing a chronicle of his and Armin's village and its fate, might be proud if he only knew. Armin was late, and he headed down the wide hallway to the corner lounge used for tutoring and TA office hours. The new hall's wooden floors were shining, and the resinous smell of wax and wood flooded his nostrils. He opened the lounge door and saw a blonde freshman sitting next to his desk, an 18-year-old American girl. "Bonjour, Mary Ellen," the tutor said. On Wednesday he had met her for the first time and planned their course of action. Today was Friday, and she would be reciting for the first time a poem she was preparing to memorize, one of Verlaine's brief romans sans paroles. Mary Ellen was like the rosy-cheeked, well-fed girls he had first seen in New York's Grand Central Station when he had boarded the train and surveyed the other passengers headed west. He had stopped at the candy stall, pointed to the bars of chocolate, and laid $1 down on the counter. The attendant asked incomprehensibly, "You want a whole dollar's worth?" The bars were all he consumed during the days and nights on the train to California. Other passengers would board and depart in waves all across the country, tall, short, friendly, or gruff. The American women, whether bourgeois ladies or country girls, looked alike for the most part. They looked like Mary Ellen. She was pretty, but was this really a woman, with soul in her eyes, mystery in her body, knowledge in her brain? "Mary Ellen, récitez le poème de Verlaine, s'il vous plaît," he said. "Le poème de Verlaine," she repeated with an American twang. "Il pleut dans mon cœur, comme il pleut sur la vie." Her smiling hesitations told him that no rain fell in her heart as it fell on the city for Verlaine. No causeless pain penetrated her soul. Sorrow did not threaten to swallow her whole. He did not blame her, though he would have liked to dismiss her. Instead, he painstakingly corrected her pronunciation. Armin remembered how Oshagan had led him patiently through the poems of Verlaine and Baudelaire. Oshagan was a born teacher, but not Armin. A second student arrived in the TA's office, and so his Friday morning proceeded. After tutoring students, he had a cup of coffee and a chocolate bar. Then at 11 in the morning, he attended a seminar on Renaissance French drama for seniors and graduate students. The old professor droned on in French about versification in Racine's Phèdre. He never acknowledged how the language captures her tortured sensuality, or how moving is her tragic passion. Armin's whole soul was intoxicated by the singing of the verse. The California sun had already burned off the fog and the clouds when he walked down the cement steps of Wheeler Hall, through Sather Gate, and then by the same shops he had passed before. When he was a block away from Mrs. Hagopian's, he looked carefully at the distant driveway. A yellow car was parked there. Through the window his brothers sat alone at the long table in Madame Hagopian's dining room. He must have driven their yellow Dodge up from Fresno. The two brothers had bought the roadster together a few years ago, just after their break with Uncle Haig. Ervant was 19, and had been only a child in 1915, and had not seen or suffered so much. It had taken Armin time to trust his brother, but he did now, even with their Dodge. Suddenly Ervant looked up, leapt from his chair, and shouted his name. "You're here," Armin cried, and then, as he always did, he assumed the worst. "Who died?" No, Ervant said. "No one died. I just wanted to surprise you." His brother reached out to hug him, and they kissed each other on the cheek. "So what is it that draws you from forlorn Fresno to this magnificent city?" Armin said in Armenian, and his brother smiled. "I had to drive up. I hear Gloria whispering to me from North Beach," Ervant said, quiet and deadpan. But then he couldn't help grinning and flashing his hooded eyes. Armin grinned too, but he could not forget the warnings against syphilis pictured on Red Cross signs and in public offices, the grim reaper descending on unsuspecting couples. Ervant never seemed to feel ghostly or numb, and so he could indulge himself. He could invent stories at will, become wild at a moment's notice, or even lie sometimes. Armin felt so high-spirited only in his poems. That was the one place where he felt his blood surge, and of course only occasionally in his political speeches. Mrs. Hagopian swung the dining room door open and entered, carrying platters of lunch foods. It was after 1, and there were no other boarders at the table. "Please sit down," she said to them. "I hope you are hungry." She brought them a decanter of strong coffee and filled their cups. "Thank you so much, Madame Baroness," Armin said. "Yes, thank you so much, Madame Baroness," Ervant repeated. She poured a cup for herself and joined them as they filled their plates. Armin sat eating, and he felt a familiar strangeness, as if he were separated from both the past and the present. His memories were always there, but he felt somehow barely present in them, and in the present he felt the same separation. His face was stiff and furrowed, and his compact 24-year-old body felt thick and numb. As he sipped the black coffee his landlady had poured, he took all the care he could to show his respect for the extraordinary woman sitting next to him, and she seemed to feel great pleasure in helping Armin, who as a teenager had been a part of the cultured Constantinople Armenian life she so missed. On the two brothers' plates were slices of lox on crusty Italian bread. There were also sliced oranges, blue-veined Roquefort, and large Greek olives. Mrs. Hagopian said in Armenian, "The smoked salmon is from the delicatessen, not as good as in the old country." "It's a brave new world," Armin said in English. Ervant, with his pomaded hair, silently hunched forward as he ate and sipped his coffee. Reverting to Armenian, Armin said, "We used to eat plump, oil-cured olives in Constantinople. Anchovies, the brine washed off, had the savor of a kiss. And oranges tasted of sunlight and the tree." He extended his hand in a wistful gesture over the table. "Yes," Ervant said, without looking up. "A beautiful country, Turkey. Beautiful food and beautiful sun. But not so beautiful when they massacre more than 1 million of you. We're lucky. If we had stayed in our village, we'd all be dead. They would have murdered us without question. His brother was right, Armin knew, but he had to change the subject for Mrs. Hagopian's sake. Ervant, I was just thinking about when you came to America. Sure, Ervant said. When Uncle Haig brought us to America, and why? To use us. We worked for Sunmaid and Del Monte, Armin said. He saw that his landlady was listening, though he was not sure that this emissary from their lost world quite understood. We were paid very, very little. But what a buck could get you, Ervant smiled shyly. Even a couple of very nice nights in San Francisco. It's important not to live for the dollar, Mrs. Hagopian said with polite fervor. She was objecting to Ervant's excess, and Armin restrained his smile as he remembered his brother's bravado, even as a child. When he was 9, at his entrance exam for school in Constantinople in 1914, the boy was asked about Roman history, and he spoke extemporaneously for 20 minutes. The examining professor said, "That is the most fascinating account of Roman history I have ever heard. Unfortunately, not a word of it is true." But Ervant was admitted, probably because of his performance. "It's true, Baroness," Armin said now. "You can't count on money. Anyway, it soon became scarce for us." "Right, and soon there was no money at all," Ervant said, "because we stopped working for Uncle Haig." "That was your fault," Armin teased in a suddenly neutral voice, as if they were playing cards. "Somebody had to call his bluff, so I did. Uncle Haig would dress up in his clean white shirt and spiffy tie and spend his days at the Armenian coffee house, and one day, after we all came in, dirty and worn out from the fields, even Mama, his own sister, I asked him, 'Uncle, how much is in the savings box now?'" Ervant was now stretching his eyes out dramatically in front of Armin and his landlady. "Haig flew into a rage. Mama kept apologizing for me. She begged him to calm down, but he kept shouting how ungrateful we were. He never should have brought us from Turkey. He would have been better off bringing sacks of wheat. 'I'll give you the money, sure,' he yelled, 'and I'll hang myself. Will that satisfy you?' With that, he stomped out, and we never got a dollar from him. We began working for ourselves, and now you're at Berkeley, and I'm on my way to Frisco." "What's important is the family survives," Mrs. Hagopian said. "What can we do after all that has happened? We say we are fine, so we can seem fine, or at least pretend." As she talked in Armenian, Armin felt their conversation was itself like the food before them, nurturing them. He felt like singing a folk song about good wine and good food. But now his landlady began talking about the fate of Armenia after the genocide. In 1920, Turkey had threatened to invade across the Arax River near Mount Ararat, and Lenin saved their homeland by sending Russian troops to the border. "It was the only way we survived," Mrs. Hagopian said. "The only way," Armin said, "as a Soviet republic. There's hardship, even starvation, I know. But there is hope," Mrs. Hagopian said. Okay, but what a cost," Ervant said. "How many people did Lenin murder when he created the Soviet republics? And who knows how many Stalin will kill?" "The Soviets," Armin said too loudly, "saved Armenia from extermination." But now another student boarder wandered into the dining room, looking surprised. Mrs. Hagopian got up to greet him in her clear, slightly accented English. Ervant whispered urgently, "Brother, I have to talk to you alone right away." In English, Armin told his landlady they needed to talk privately. As they rose to go into the living room, he glimpsed a forlornness in her face. He felt tears unbidden rising in his eyes. It was as if their leaving the dining room were some sort of grave farewell. It was irrational, he knew, for they were just doing what everyone did in America, hurrying on their way from point to point, one collision to another. Talking with his brother was one such collision. Ervant's ebullience made Berkeley seem unreal, and Armin, weighted down by his obligations, was drawn to his younger brother's sense that reality was a crapshoot, where you had to watch for the advantage and take pleasure when life allowed, where chance reigned and fate could always intervene. "Armin, something has come up," Ervant said as they sat on the couch in the empty living room. "We don't have much time. We must decide this weekend or we're lost. I'm telling you, it's our only chance to get rich. I can get a 1-year lease on 320 acres 20 miles outside of Fresno. Prime land, raisins and peach. But I can't do it without you. If you go in, Arsena's husband will go in. And we can't lose if Nubar works with us. I need you, Armin. It's why I drove up. Mother and our sister, we all need you." Armin was stunned. "I'm not asking you to decide right now anyway. I'm itching to spend the evening with Gloria. You tell me tomorrow." "Ervant, do you see what you're asking?" He could hardly speak. "Listen, Armin, just think about it. I'll come back by noon tomorrow." They walked in silence onto the porch. He saw his brother to the yellow Dodge and watched him drive down Channing Way through the crisp February afternoon. In the boarding house, Armin climbed the stairs to his small room with its bed, desk, chest, and stacks of books. There was a photo of Lenin that Madame Hagopian had placed on the wall. Sitting mechanically at his desk, he started to imagine abandoning his life here and returning to the San Joaquin Valley for a life on the land near Fresno. From an envelope in his desk drawer, he took some photographs. Among them was one of big Uncle Haig and himself, taken when he first arrived in California. Haig wore a pinstripe suit, a shimmering tie, and two-tone shoes. The handsome man sat on an elegant chair with claws carved onto the ends of the arms. One of his big, powerful hands held a claw in its grip. The other rested in a loose fist on a crossed leg. Next to him, Armin stood, dwarfed and wide-eyed, dressed in a corduroy suit, with his thick, wavy hair combed but barely under control. He rested his hand on the shoulder of his seated uncle, who seemed twice Armin's size. Haig had pale, expressionless, Northern European-looking eyes. One of them squinted as if he were taking aim at you. The other was open and unblinking. This was the man who met Armin in the train station in Sacramento in June of 1920 and greeted him by reaching up and knocking away the beret that Armin had worn for years in Constantinople. Uncle drove them downstate, past Fresno to Delano, where he and the other workers taught him how to labor in the fields, how to cope with the ache and sweat, how to conserve his back as he leaned to work, and how to bathe his swollen hands in vinegar at night. This was the giant who, like a Turk, slammed a co-worker up against a tree one afternoon, holding him there, one large hand tightening around the man's neck, as if he would rip out his throat, or, if an axe was handy, hack off his head. Uncle Haig was always ready for violence, but he was blind to his own brutality. He said proudly that he had killed a man in a knife fight in Bulgaria when he first fled from Turkey. Always he was on the verge of exploding. Yet Armin understood his uncle. He remembered his first days in the fields when he felt the blinding sun blast his consciousness. At night, on this reclaimed desert, the temperature dropped from 110 to 70 as the flatland descended into darkness. Suddenly, you were almost invisible and bathed in numbing air. It was a blasted desolation you felt, reducing all the life you knew to your body and its basic functioning, breathing and sleeping, eating and excreting, killing or dying. Your mouth was silenced, and your eyes stared blankly at the blackened, endless, moonless fields. A year ago, the great Armenian general Andranik Ozanyan had talked with Armen about the ruthless Fresno sun and the cruelty of life. Asthmatic but unbroken, Andranik had recently moved to Fresno. Sitting with Armen at the coffee house, the steely man with strangely kind eyes had said, "You're a fine, well-spoken young man, Armen. But life is a vicious dog, and it will sink its teeth into you if you let it." Yes, he understood Uncle Haig. All the Armenian immigrants here had been permanently scarred by what they carried with them from Turkey. They had been cast out of their homeland and ended up here in the Wild West, this vast, vacant, sun-baked land, where they all were one step away from being gunslingers, their outrage always close at hand. You had to be ready for someone to murder or to be murdered. Did someone die? Was always the first question you asked. How could such knowledge fit into a student's life? He remembered the hours he had spent translating Anatole France's Thais into Armenian, his tremendous effort to capture its voluptuous asceticism. And yet his goal to become a poet and intellectual seemed unreal and false now. All the learning from his apprenticeship with Oshagan, and all the poetry he loved by Verlaine and Mallarmé, how could his awareness of all this fit into the life of an immigrant in this savage world? Finally, it was idle to try pursuing an American profession, for it would involve the unimaginable labor of remaking himself completely. And what profession would let him enter it? Anyway, his fate was to float between worlds, among languages. He was an Armenian in America, in this land halfway around the globe from Anatolia, so words, whether Armenian or French, English or Turkish, became unreal. They could only bob and float, ungrounded and almost unspeakable. Words would not survive unscathed after the murder of 1.5 million Armenians and the exile of another 1 million. Siktir Pesavang! The Turkish obscenity exploded from him. He was not sure to whom he directed it. Fate, the Turks, America, himself, or his brother for making everything clear. It echoed hopelessly in the empty room. Armen opened the French-Armenian dictionary on his desk, and the pages of words seemed all at once seductive and untrackable. He would take his books with him back to Fresno, and they would be a lifelong reminder of literature and its temptations. As he was closing the dictionary, he looked at the flyleaf. In the fall, when he first came to Berkeley, he had copied a sentence there. Je cherche toujours pour trouver une maison favorable pour moi. I try continually to find a favorable abode for myself. For him, there was no favorable place. He felt, too, his lack of any true companion. The image of a small, beautiful, golden woman entered his mind. Not a seductress like Thais, not a bearer of the syphilis he feared. No, rather, she was the muse he yearned for, a muse and soulmate.